They say there's a moment in every relationship where you know. The knowledge lingers, grows inside you like an uninvited guest. For me, that moment came on our 10th anniversary, but I didn't understand it right away. We were at some fancy hotel in the city, our first night away in ages, and the champagne flutes sparkled on the table between us. Maya sat across from me, her eyes on the view outside an endless wash of city lights and blurred stars. She looked beautiful, striking even. Her dress, all sleek lines and deep color, hugged her in a way that made me remember why I'd fallen for her. But as the waiter poured our wine, she didn't even look at me, didn't smile or crack one of those private jokes we used to have. She just stared out at the city as though I weren't even there. I swallowed the creeping disappointment and tried to brush it off. Quite the view, huh? Her gaze shifted, eyes briefly meeting mine with a hint of a polite smile. Yeah, it is. The response felt like a slap in the face. 10 years together, and all she could muster was a line that could have been given to a stranger at a cocktail party. But I forced myself to keep my tone light. I booked this place because I remembered you loved that one rooftop bar we went to in Chicago, I said, trying to coax out a memory, a laugh, some trace of the warmth we used to have. She looked back out the window, barely nodding. Yeah, I remember. Silence settled between us. It wasn't that I didn't still love her, I did, in a way. I'd spent years building a life with this woman, the ups and downs, the close calls with financial trouble when we were just starting out. I'd done everything I could to make sure she was happy. But tonight, with the empty champagne flutes and the distant city lights, I saw it for the first time, the fracture. The truth I'd been too blind to accept. We weren't the same people who'd started out, and she. Well, maybe she didn't love me anymore. Maybe she'd just learned how to endure me, as one does with a bad habit they can't quite quit. I didn't push it, not then. Instead, I let the evening slip away, the two of us sitting in silence, letting the skyline fill the void between us. The months after that dinner, I tried everything to win her back. Flowers on random Wednesdays, surprise weekend getaways, even signing up for a cooking class I knew she'd been hinting at for years. I thought maybe it was the routine that had gotten to her, that maybe she needed a break from the day-to-day drudgery. But with every attempt, she seemed more and more detached, like I was reaching through glass that only I could feel. One night, I brought home tickets to Italy. A whole week off work, something I'd never done before. I thought I'd finally cracked the code, something that would wake her up, shake us both back into who we used to be. But she didn't smile, didn't laugh in that way she used to when I pulled out some over-the-top surprise. She just tilted her head, an unreadable expression settling over her face. Why are you doing this, she asked, her voice so flat it stunned me. Why? Maya, it's Italy? We've both talked about it for years, and I just thought. She cut me off with a sigh. I never asked for this. You've just been throwing things at me like I'm some problem to solve. She looked away, pressing her lips into a thin line. I don't need you to take me to Italy, Derek. I just need you to. I don't know. Stop smothering me. The words hit like a fist to the gut. Stop smothering me. Had I really been doing that? All I'd ever wanted was to show her how much I cared, how committed I was to us. But instead, she looked at me like I was the enemy, an obstacle keeping her from whatever it was she thought she wanted. That night, she slept in the guest room. And for the first time, I didn't go after her. The year that followed was a delicate dance of avoidance, an unspoken agreement to pretend that we weren't hurtling towards something inevitable. She'd spend more and more time out with friends, or at least that's what she told me. She picked up a new workout routine, a fresh obsession that had her up at dawn and gone until late in the evenings. She was in the best shape of her life, glowing in a way that left me feeling hollow. I used to think that glow was something I gave her. Now I wasn't so sure it had anything to do with me. It was around that time I started noticing little things, the text messages she'd quickly slide out of sight, the vague work dinners that left her coming home at strange hours, the way her smile felt forced when she finally did show up. I knew I should confront her, but I didn't. Instead, I let my doubts fester, a gnawing sickness I couldn't shake. One night, I woke up alone in bed and heard her muffled voice from the hallway, barely a whisper. I know, but it's complicated. No, he doesn't know anything. Not yet. I froze, a chill settling over me. There was no mistaking what that sounded like. He doesn't know anything. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, as I listened to her footsteps padding back to the guest room. In the morning, she acted like nothing had happened, like the world was exactly as it should be. But I couldn't pretend anymore. I felt like a stranger in my own house, every object somehow tainted by the knowledge that there was someone else in the picture. And yet, for all the hurt and anger, I still didn't confront her. There was a part of me that didn't want to face the truth. I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was all in my head. A few months later, she finally told me she wanted a divorce. We were standing in the kitchen, her voice eerily calm as she said the words, "I don't think we're happy together anymore, Derek. I think it's time we both moved on." I stared at her, a silent fury bubbling up inside me. "Moved on to what, Maya? You've already got someone waiting for you, don't you?" Her eyes flickered, barely, but it was enough to tell me I was right. She didn't deny it, didn't even try to soften the blow. "Maybe it's best if we don't do this now," she murmured, turning away. But I couldn't let it go. All those nights out, those late work dinners, you thought I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't figure it out. She looked back at me, her face blank, drained of any warmth. "I didn't plan it this way, Derek. It just happened." I felt something crack in me, like a dam breaking under pressure. All the nights of silence, the buried resentment, the bitterness, it all surged forward, choking me. "So that's it? 10 years and you're just done? You think you can walk away and build this new, shiny life for yourself?" She just shook her head, a faint look of pity flickering over her face. "Maybe you should try to build one too, Derek." That was all it took. That single, dismissive suggestion, as though I was the one left clinging to something broken. As though I were some relic of the past, something she'd outgrown. The divorce was fast. She'd already done her part, lined everything up with her lawyer so that by the time the papers arrived, I barely had a say. She wanted the house, the cars, the joint accounts. She even took half of my retirement savings. It was a clean sweep, her brand new life funded by everything I'd spent a decade building. I could have fought back, but by that point I didn't even know what I'd be fighting for. Every memory, every piece of furniture, every joint account felt poisoned by the betrayal. And so, in the end, I let her take it. All of it. Eh? Or at least that's what she thought. Because as I stood there watching her walk away with everything I'd worked for, I knew there was one thing she hadn't counted on. I was going to make sure she ended up with nothing worth having. I was going to watch her perfect, curated life crumble piece by piece. And maybe it was petty, maybe it was wrong. But in that moment, it felt like the only justice left. The morning after she left, I sat in the half-empty house and felt the weight of her absence settle over me. It wasn't a feeling of relief or grief, it was cold, empty anger, the kind that carves itself into your bones. This wasn't a new beginning, it was scorched earth. I'd given her a chance to explain, to tell me why, but she'd only deflected, tossing out empty phrases about how we'd grown apart, but it wasn't distance she wanted. She wanted a life without me in it. As I picked up the last of her things, stupid little mementos that didn't fit into her pristine new life, I decided it was time to start my own version of moving on. I wasn't going to sit there, helpless, watching her live a life of luxury on my hard-earned money while I scraped by in the scraps she'd left me. She'd chosen to take everything, now she was going to learn what it meant to lose it all. The first phase was subtle sabotage. If Maya was expecting to waltz into a new life with her every comfort intact, she was going to be in for a surprise. It didn't take long to figure out her schedule after 10 years together. Her habits were ingrained into my mind like clockwork. She'd mentioned the new place she'd found downtown, some glass-walled, high-rise apartment that screamed luxury. She loved those pretentious little luxuries, the things that made her feel like she'd climbed above the rest. So I started there. Her new yoga studio, Core Revolution, was her latest obsession. She loved to brag to our old friends that she had a membership waitlist that was months long, and that the classes were so exclusive they required booking weeks in advance. She lived for the image, the idea of belonging to an elite crowd, like a queen among her lesser subjects. It didn't take much to ruin that for her. A few phone calls under a fake name, a fabricated story about inappropriate behavior and verbal harassment. Within a week, I'd managed to convince the management that she was disturbing other clients with her aggressive attitude. It must have stung. One day she was at the top of her game, the next she was banned. I like to imagine her turning up one morning, decked out in high-end workout gear, only to be turned away, her name blacklisted from the client roster. A minor setback, but enough to leave a sour taste. Then came her social life. She'd spent years curating a circle of friends who were more like followers, a mix of well-to-do women and wannabe influencers who fawned over her every Instagram post. She was careful to present an image, making herself look effortlessly perfect, flawless, enviable. The kinds of people she'd cultivated weren't there for her, they were there for the glamour, the facade she'd put on. With a little patience, I managed to slip into that circle, in a way. I reached out to a few people, some who knew her, some who didn't but liked a good story, and started a whisper campaign. A couple of messages here, a carefully worded hint there, And soon enough, the rumors began. A small story about her outbursts at Core Revolution. An anonymous post from someone who claimed she'd seen Maya cheating long before the divorce. The best part? None of it had to be true. All it took was the faintest whiff of drama, and the crowd did the rest. I heard from a mutual friend a week later that people were starting to talk about Maya, and that she'd been left off the guest list for one of her beloved charity events. She tried to put on a brave face in public, of course, but it was obvious to anyone who knew her that the isolation was starting to sting. Watching her scramble was satisfying, but I wanted more. I wanted her to feel the weight of every little loss as her life unraveled. So I turned my attention to her career. Maya had spent a small fortune setting up her own handbag line after the divorce, throwing every dollar of our joint savings into a brand that was as self-important as she was. She'd envisioned herself as some kind of fashion mogul, someone who'd climb the ranks of the elite, all while raking in profits. The business was barely off the ground, still depending on the goodwill of investors and high-profile connections she'd cultivated over the years. It was fragile one misstep, and it would all crumble. So I gave it a nudge. I called up a friend from my own line of work, someone who owed me a favor, and arranged a few well-placed comments about financial discrepancies and mismanaged funds with one of her biggest investors. It was only a matter of days before her emails stopped coming back, her funding dried up, and the handbag line was dead in the water. She must have felt it, that steady decline, the world slipping from her grip. From what I heard, she tried to cover up the cracks, started reaching out to her old friends in desperation, even tried to set up a crowdfunding campaign online, but the story had already spread. The more she tried to pull herself back up, the more everyone around her lost interest, seeing her for what she really was, someone desperate to hold on to a lifestyle that had vanished. The final touch was her precious apartment. I had a contractor friend who specialized in creative renovations. A few weeks after her funding ran dry, she started experiencing a series of issues with her place. It started small, strange power outages, flickering lights that came and went, mysterious plumbing issues that seemed to repair themselves before the maintenance team could arrive. Just enough to be a nuisance to keep her on edge. I imagined her sleepless nights, the way every strange sound in the dark must have kept her up, staring at the ceiling, wondering why her perfect life was falling apart around her. Every report she made to the building management was met with polite reassurances that nothing was wrong. It was beautiful, really a slow descent, a perfect symphony of frustrations that left her with nowhere to turn. Months passed, and by the end of it, she was barely a shadow of the woman she'd been. The apartment was gone, foreclosed after she'd fallen behind on her payments. The handbag brand was a memory, her social life in tatters. I saw her once from a distance, shuffling through a grocery store with a cart that barely held a few items, her hair pulled back in a loose, careless ponytail, her clothes simple, unbranded, far from the luxury she'd once insisted upon. She looked lost, hollow, as though the foundation of her life had been swept out from under her. And I didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. Watching her there, stripped of everything she'd taken from me, I felt something deeper than satisfaction. I felt justice. She'd taken everything from me, my home, my money, my years, and built herself a palace of lies. Now, she stood there with nothing but the truth, a life as empty as the promises she'd made to me. In a way, we were finally even.